Now you will learn what history textbooks don't tell you. Have you ever wondered how the Vikings forged deadly swords from bog iron? Their methods are still surprising and shocking today. In the harsh lands of Scandinavia, where survival was a daily struggle, the Vikings created weapons that became legendary. They had no deep mines or modern blast furnaces. Their main source of metal was boggy swamps and rusty streams. Northern blacksmiths learned to transform unremarkable mud and ore hidden underwater into blades of unmatched strength and beauty. This process was on the verge of craftsmanship, hard work, and what many would call magic. It required a deep understanding of nature and fire. This is the story of how deadly steel was born from swamp sludge, how patience and knowledge conquered the elements. Watch the video to the end to find out why swamp iron was both a curse and a blessing for blacksmiths, and what secret ingredient made Viking swords flexible and sharp. What if I told you that the most formidable swords of the Viking era were forged not from mountain ore, but from ordinary bog mud? This is not a metaphor, but the harsh reality of Scandinavian craftsmen. The basis for their legendary weapons was so-called bog or lake iron. This resource consisted of porous formations that formed at the bottom of swamps, lakes, and river floodplains. Over centuries, billions of iron bacteria concentrated the iron dissolved in the water, turning it into solid lumps of ore. For the Vikings, these unassuming-looking stones were a real treasure. Unlike mountain ore, which had to be mined, bog iron lay literally at their feet. It could be collected in shallow water by simply probing with a long pole or raking it from the bottom.
See how the water shimmers, my son? That's where the iron hides.
It was a renewable resource, as new layers of ore grew in just a few decades. The collection process itself was exhausting and dirty work. People had to stand in cold water for hours, methodically examining the bottom. The pieces of ore found resembled rusty, lumpy sponges filled with silt and organic matter. At first glance, it was hard to believe that this material could be used to create anything of value. It was fragile, dirty, and contained relatively little pure iron. However, it had one key advantage that the Vikings learned to exploit to the fullest. Bog iron contained large amounts of phosphorus, which was a natural alloying element. When processed correctly, this phosphorus gave the metal additional hardness. It was a natural secret that blacksmiths discovered through trial and error.
That's how we get it to be perfectly flat, you see?
The very idea of turning mud into a deadly blade seems incredible. This metal alchemy required not only strength, but also deep knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Every stage, from collection to forging, was fraught with risk and hard work. The collected ore was piled into large heaps on the shore to dry. It had to spend several months in the open air to get rid of excess moisture. Only then did the first stage of its transformation into metal begin. The Vikings saw no difference between craftsmanship and magic. For them, they were two sides of the same process. Turning stone into steel was a sacred ritual that required respect for the elements of fire and earth. It was this approach that allowed them to create masterpieces. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think about such an unusual source of metal for making weapons? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Are you ready to learn the truth about the first fiery stage of turning ore into metal? After the bog ore was collected and dried, it could not be sent to the smelting furnace right away. It still contained too much clay, silt, and organic debris, which interfered with the process. To clean the ore, the Vikings used a method called roasting. They built a large wood fire on the ground. When it was burning well, they carefully laid a layer of dried ore on top, then another layer of wood, and so on several times, creating a kind of layered cake. This huge fire had to burn for several hours. The high temperature burned away all the organic matter, evaporated the remaining moisture, and made the ore more brittle. During the roasting process, the ore lumps changed color from brown to dark red or black. After the fire burned out and cooled down, the roasted ore could be easily crushed. It was broken into small pieces, about the size of a nut, with hammers. This was done so that the hot gases in the smelting furnace could pass evenly through the layer of ore, ensuring high-quality iron recovery.
If you don't crush the ore evenly, you will not get the perfect smelting process that we need.
This stage was critically important. If the roasting was skipped, either the smelting would fail completely, or the result would be very dirty metal with a large amount of slag. It was dirty, smoky, but absolutely necessary work. The preparation process itself required a huge amount of resources, primarily wood. The forests of Scandinavia provided everything necessary, but harvesting firewood was a separate, labor-intensive process. Each stage required coordinated work and a significant investment of time from the community. After grinding, the ore was ready for the most important stage, smelting. For this, the Vikings built special furnaces, which were the heart of all metallurgical production. These seemingly simple structures were the result of centuries of experience and experimentation.
This furnace, a testament to our ancestors' wisdom, holds centuries of knowledge within its stones.
The construction and operation of such furnaces required special knowledge. The location for the furnace was chosen carefully, usually near a water source, and in a place protected from strong winds. The success of the entire smelting process depended directly on the correct design of the furnace.
And you see here how the draft from the furnace pulls the heat down.
Thus, the path from a marshy mound to raw materials ready for smelting was long and laborious. It required patience, physical strength, and an understanding of the hidden properties of materials. This was the first, but far from the last, step in the Great Transformation. How difficult do you think it was to maintain a stable temperature in the fire for uniform roasting of the ore? In the next chapter, we will reveal the main secret of the Viking blacksmith's craftsmanship, which still amazes historians today.
It requires patience and a certain kind of strength, not just in your hands, but in your heart.
What you are about to learn was a hidden truth that has only been revealed by modern research. The greatest Viking swords, such as the legendary Ulfbert, were not made from a single piece of steel. Their blades were a complex composite structure created using pattern welding technology. This technique was the pinnacle of blacksmithing at the time. The master took several strips of metal with different carbon contents: soft, low-carbon iron and hard, high-carbon steel. It was the combination of these two materials that gave the blade its unique properties. The strips of metal were heated in a furnace to welding temperature and welded together using blacksmithing techniques, forging them into a single rod. This rod was then reheated and twisted along its axis, like a rope. The number and direction of the twists depended on the desired pattern. After twisting, the rod was hammered again to make it flat. Often, two or more of these twisted rods were welded together to create an even more complex pattern. This process was repeated many times until the master craftsman obtained the central part of the future blade. This central core of the blade was both strong and elastic. The soft layers of iron prevented the blade from breaking under heavy impact, acting as a shock absorber. The hard layers of steel provided the necessary rigidity to the structure. The blacksmith welded blades of pure, hardest steel to this patterned core. It was a delicate process that required incredible precision. The slightest mistake would ruin days of work.
The secret to a good blade lies not just in the heat, but in the patience and precision of your hand.
After welding and giving the blade its final shape, it was ground and acid etched. The acid affected metals with different carbon contents in different ways. As a result, a complex, beautiful pattern resembling waves or intertwined braids appeared on the surface of the blade. This pattern was not just a decoration, but a kind of certificate of quality. It clearly demonstrated the complexity of the work and the highest skill of the master. Such a sword was not only a formidable weapon, but also a status symbol, a true work of art. The technology of pattern welding required not only physical strength from the blacksmith, but also an intuitive feel for metal. He had to determine the temperature by eye and sense when the metal was ready for welding. This was knowledge that could not be described in books. It was swords like these that made the Viking era's weaponsmiths famous. They were not the result of magic, but of the highest technological skill, perfected to perfection. Each blade was the material embodiment of its creator's experience and talent. Guess how many trees had to be cut down to forge a single sword? The answer may shock you. The entire process, from roasting the ore to forging the blade, required a huge amount of charcoal, not ordinary firewood. Charcoal was the only fuel capable of reaching the temperature necessary to smelt iron. It burns hotter and more evenly than wood, and contains virtually no impurities, such as sulfur, that could spoil the metal. Therefore, charcoal production was a separate and vital industry. The process of obtaining charcoal was long and laborious. Wood, usually hardwood, was tightly packed into large piles called charcoal pits. These piles were covered with a layer of turf and earth, leaving only small holes for smoke to escape and air to enter. Then the wood inside the pile was set on fire. The charcoal burner's task was to prevent the wood from burning completely. He had to control the slow, smouldering process for several days or even weeks, regulating the air supply with dampers. As a result of this pyrolysis, or burning without oxygen, the wood was converted into pure carbon, charcoal. This process required a great deal of experience and attention. Too much air and the whole pile would burn to ashes. Too little and the process would stop. It has been calculated that 4 to 10 kilograms of charcoal were required to produce 1 kilogram of iron. And to obtain charcoal, in turn, it was necessary to burn several times more wood. The production of a sword weighing 1 kilogram could require the felling of several dozen mature trees. This means that metallurgy was one of the main factors influencing the landscape. Around large settlements where smithing was actively practiced, forests could be cut down for many kilometers. This forced people to look for new sources of wood or relocate production.
We should expand the charcoal production further into the forest there.
I agree. We need more for the winter.
Charcoal was a strategic resource, no less important than the ore itself. Control over forests and charcoal production gave a huge advantage. Without this black, porous fuel, all Viking metallurgy would have been impossible. Every blacksmith needed a steady supply of high-quality charcoal. Blacksmiths' workshops and smelting works were often located right in the forest, closer to the source of fuel. This reduced the cost of transporting heavy and fragile charcoal. How much do you think such industrial activity affected the environment at that time? In the next chapter, you will learn how the Vikings built their primitive blast furnaces, in which dirt was turned into metal. At the center of the entire metallurgical process was the smelting furnace, or bloomery. It was a simple but effective structure that the Vikings built from readily available materials. The success of the entire enterprise depended on its proper construction and operation. The furnace was a vertical shaft, built of clay, mixed with straw or grass for reinforcement. The walls were made thick enough to withstand high temperatures. Often, the furnace was additionally lined with stones for strength and better heat retention. The height of such a furnace usually did not exceed 1.5 meters. The diameter of the inner chamber was about 30 to 40 centimeters. A furnace that was too large would require too much coal and effort to maintain the temperature, while one that was too small would be unproductive. An opening was left at the bottom of the furnace to release slag, molten impurities from the ore. There was also a nozzle, or tuyere, at the bottom through which air was fed into the furnace. The tuyere was made of fired clay, as it had to withstand direct contact with hot coals. The air supply was a key element of the process. Large leather bellows were used for this purpose, which had to be pumped manually throughout the smelting process. This monotonous but vital work required great physical endurance. Before starting the smelting process, the furnace had to be preheated. A fire was lit inside, which burned for several hours, drying the clay walls and preparing the furnace for operation. Only then could the fuel and ore be loaded. The construction and maintenance of such a furnace required special knowledge. The craftsmen knew exactly what clay to use and how to mix it correctly with reinforcing materials. These secrets were passed down from father to son. This seemingly simple design was the result of centuries of trial and error. It was perfectly adapted to the available resources and materials. It was in this clay heart that the main mystery took place, the birth of iron. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what was actually extracted from the smelting furnace? It was not liquid metal, as in modern blast furnaces. The wet smelting process produced a lumpy, spongy piece of iron saturated with slag, which was called pig iron. The smelting process began with loading charcoals into a preheated furnace. When the coal burned to the desired temperature, the master began to alternately pour layers of crushed ore and coal. The bellows worked continuously, pumping air into the furnace and maintaining the heat. The temperature inside the furnace reached approximately 1200 degrees Celsius. This temperature was sufficient to reduce iron from oxides, but not to melt it. The iron in the furnace never turned into a liquid state. At the same time, the empty rock contained in the ore melted, forming liquid slag. This slag flowed to the bottom of the furnace and was removed through a special opening. It carried away most of the harmful impurities, purifying the future iron. The particles of reduced iron settled in the furnace, fusing together into a single porous mass. The entire smelting process could take from several hours to a whole day, depending on the size of the furnace and the quality of the ore. All this time, several people had to work the bellows non-stop and add fuel. When the master decided that the process was complete, the bellows were stopped. The furnaces were allowed to cool slightly, after which the front wall was dismantled. Using long tongs, the blacksmiths extracted the bloom from the red-hot interior of the furnace. This was the climax, and the most spectacular moment. The white-hot bloomery iron weighed several kilograms and looked like a large, shapeless piece of metal and slag. Sparks flew from it, and it glowed with an unearthly light in the twilight of the forge. What kind of physical effort do you think it took to work with bellows all day long? In the next chapter, you will learn how a shapeless piece of red-hot sponge was turned into strong, uniform metal. Immediately after being removed from the furnace, the red-hot bloom was placed on an anvil. One of the most difficult and noisy stages began, primary forging. The blacksmith's task was to compact the porous metal and squeeze out the remaining liquid slag. Several people, working with large hammers, began to methodically tap the ingot from all sides. With each blow, fountains of fiery sparks flew out of the red-hot mass. This was the slag. The work required coordination and precise rhythm. This process was similar to squeezing water out of a sponge. Gradually, blow after blow, the porous and fragile material became denser and more homogeneous. The blacksmith had to constantly turn the bloom to work on it from all sides. During the forging process, the ingot cooled down and had to be sent back to the forge again and again to be reheated. The work progressed slowly. It could take several hours to turn one ingot into a dense bar of metal. During this process, a significant amount of weight was lost. Sometimes up to half of the original weight of the bloom was lost to slag. This was an inevitable but necessary process of purifying and compacting the metal. The result was so-called welding steel, a blank ready for further forging. It was still heterogeneous in its chemical composition. Different parts of it had different carbon contents. It was this heterogeneity that was the key to the technology of pattern welding. An experienced blacksmith could roughly determine the properties of the metal by its color and how it responded to processing. He selected softer and harder pieces to later combine them into a single blade. Pure iron obtained from bloom was too soft to make a good blade. It bent easily and quickly became blunt. To make it hard, it had to be turned into steel, that is, saturated with carbon. The Vikings did not have modern methods of steel production. They used a process called cementation, or carburization. This process took place directly in the forge, which was heated with charcoal. The blacksmith repeatedly heated the iron blank in the hottest part of the forge, in the thick of the hot coals. At high temperatures, the surface of the iron actively absorbed carbon from the fuel. This process was slow and required great skill. To speed up and make carbonization more uniform, blacksmiths used a method of repeated forging and folding. The blank was heated, forged into a thin plate, then folded in half and welded again with blacksmith welding. This process was repeated dozens and sometimes hundreds of times. Each folding doubled the number of layers in the blank. At the same time, the carbon absorbed from the surface was distributed throughout the entire volume of the metal. In addition, this process made the metal structure more homogeneous and removed slag residues. An experienced master could control the carbon content by changing the temperature in the furnace and the holding time. This was intuitive knowledge based on years of experience. He judged the readiness of the metal by the color of the heat and how it sparkled when struck.
Soft, low-carbon core for resilience, and the hard, high-carbon steel for the sharp edge.
Blacksmiths often deliberately created blanks with different carbon contents. Softer, low-carbon metal was used to make the core of the blade for elasticity. Hard, high-carbon steel, obtained through a long cementation process, was used to make the cutting edges. This process transformed simple iron into steel with specific properties. Like a sculptor, the blacksmith molded not only the shape, but also the internal structure of his future blade. The combat qualities of the weapon depended directly on this stage. After the blade was completely forged and polished, the most critical and risky stage began: heat treatment. It was this stage that transformed a piece of steel into a real weapon. The slightest mistake at this stage could instantly destroy weeks of painstaking work. Heat treatment consisted of two main processes: hardening and tempering. Hardening was necessary to make the steel as hard as possible. To do this, the blade was heated evenly to a certain temperature, which the master determined by the color of the heat, usually a cherry red color. Then the red-hot blade had to be cooled very quickly. It was immersed in a large container of water, oil, or even snow. The sudden cooling changed the internal crystal structure of the steel, making it extremely hard, but also very brittle. This moment was pure magic and a lottery. If the blade was heated unevenly or had internal defects, it could crack or warp right in the middle of the hardening process. Historians believe that the percentage of rejects at this stage was very high, even for experienced craftsmen. After hardening, the blade became as hard as glass and just as brittle. If someone tried to strike with it, it would most likely shatter into pieces. To relieve internal stresses and give the metal the necessary toughness and elasticity, a second stage was required: tempering. For tempering, the hardened blade was heated again, but to a much lower temperature, around 200 to 300 degrees. At this temperature, so-called temper colors appeared on the polished surface of the steel, ranging from light straw to blue. The craftsmen used these colors to judge the temperature and degree of tempering. Once the desired color was achieved, the blade was cooled again. Tempering made the steel slightly less hard, but significantly more durable and elastic. It is this balance of hardness and toughness that is the main characteristic of a high-quality blade.
Tempering is not just about heat. It's about finding that perfect balance, that sweet spot where the metal is strong, yet flexible.
Now the blade was ready. It was hard enough to hold its edge and elastic enough not to break in battle. All that remained was to bring it to perfection. The finished blade was still far from being called a sword. A long and painstaking finishing process began. First, the blade was carefully ground with abrasive stones of varying grit, moistened with water. Grinding removed traces of forging and hardening, leveled the surface, and formed perfectly smooth bevels to the blade. This process could take several days. It was during grinding that the hidden pattern began to appear on the surface of blades, made using pattern welding technology. Grinding was followed by polishing. This was done using leather and abrasive powders, such as crushed sandstone or clay. Polishing not only gave the blade a mirror-like shine, but also protected it from corrosion. Then it was time for sharpening. The blades were carefully sharpened on fine-grained whetstones to razor sharpness. Proper sharpening was no less important than high-quality steel. The penetrating ability of the weapon depended on it. In parallel with the work on the blade, another craftsman, and sometimes the blacksmith himself, made the parts of the hilt: the guard, the handle, and the pommel. The guard and pommel were most often made of iron or bronze and could be decorated with intricate ornamentation or inlays of precious metals. The handle was made of wood, bone, or horn. It was carefully fitted to the tang of the blade to ensure a secure and comfortable grip. The handle was often wrapped with leather or wire for better grip. When all the parts were ready, the assembly of the sword began. The guard, handle, and pommel were sequentially placed on the blade tang. Then the end of the tang was riveted over the pommel, firmly pulling the entire structure together into a single whole. This marked the end of a long journey that began in a swamp. From unremarkable rusty mud, through fire, water, and hundreds of thousands of hammer blows, a masterpiece of weaponry was born. The Viking sword was ready for battle. We have traced the entire incredible journey of creating a Viking sword. From collecting ore at the bottom of a swamp to the final polishing of the blade. This process was a true miracle of engineering, patience, and hard work. It required craftsmen to have a deep, intuitive understanding of materials and the elements. The Vikings proved that rich deposits and complex technologies are not always necessary to create the perfect weapon. Sometimes all you need is what lies literally under your feet, as well as knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Their swords are not just weapons, but monuments to human ingenuity and willpower. Which stage of this process do you think was the most difficult and required the greatest skill? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the technologies of the past.